Hello to my colleagues across the Australian Public Service and welcome to the Connecting Us podcast. My name is Mif Nazette and I work at PM&C in the Connecting Us editorial team. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this continent and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. In this edition, we're thinking about policy under pressure and featuring the stories of policy people from all across the APS who have had to pull out all the stops to keep delivering during the pandemic. With me today, I have Liz Williamson, the brand new Chief Operating Officer at Treasury and long-standing public servant. Thanks so much for being with us today, Liz.
Thanks for having me. It's great.
So Liz, you've just started at the Treasury as the coup, and we'll definitely come back to that. But can you tell us a little about the path you've taken to be here today, some of the highlights?
Oh, sure. The highlights. Well, the path I take, I always think about the physical journey I took, which took me from the hometown of Perth, where I'm from, to come to Canberra in 2004. So I came across and was an excited new graduate to jump into the Department of Finance. I'd been at uni for about 5 years and tossed up between jobs in Sydney, jobs in Perth, jobs in Canberra, but my public policy bent just brought me to Canberra. I moved to Treasury in 2006 after a couple of years at finance, into the international area where I was for a couple of years, and that international areas give you great opportunity. You get to go and do some trips overseas, which really give you amazing exposure to the big international meetings and institutions and how we sort of do real diplomacy out there in the real world, if you like, as opposed to what you study at university. So that was a really amazing time. You quickly learn, though, that what really matters in that space is the relationships you build, the relationships ministers build and public servants build. That was really the piece that I took out of that was so interesting. And then I moved into the Central Budget Policy Division of Treasury the day Lehman Brothers collapsed, which was sort of it was a big time. It was, the GFC, the global financial crisis, was underway by then, but that was a really key turning point, and it really marked the beginning of an extremely challenging environment to be a public servant and for the government. That's really the period for me where I cut my teeth in the public service, to be honest. I spent 3 years there through a time when we had to pull the levers of policy in unprecedented ways with massive household payments, supporting the financial markets, making all sorts of interventions that people probably had never anticipated making. And it was really, really challenging. But that for me was a period where you saw what it really meant to be a flexible, adaptive, pragmatic public servant. So really key period, cutting my teeth. I took 6 months off after that because I was really burnt out, and travelling the world with my now husband was a fantastic thing to do. I came back into a couple of roles, like working in G20 and as the Secretary's Executive Officer before the 2013 election, and then became the Senior Budget Advisor in the Treasurer's Office after the 2013 election. So I spent 2 years working on the Hill, and it was a really terrific but exhausting experience. Again, it's definitely an amazing thing to do as a public servant. It teaches you an awful lot about the environment, really fast-paced environment that people work in up there, and how to convey a lot of information quickly to help with decision making. There's some of the key skills, I suppose, that I took out of that time, but such an amazing opportunity to see ministers really in action and how the decision-making process really works. So I came to PM&C, went back to the public service after that, went to PM&C. Then I had my first child, my son, and returned to Treasury just as decisions were sort of being finalised to set up the Banking Royal Commission, and I worked on that for a little while before becoming a division head, working in the corporations and consumer policy type areas. So really fascinating policy journey to be involved in there during a Royal Commission. So definitely policy under pressure a little bit again. Then I went on maternity leave again and had my daughter, and I've just returned about 4 months ago now, and have been working on some of the key big policy challenges that the government's thinking about in the COVID environment, but now having stepped into the Chief Operating Officer role literally last week. It's a terrific environment to support our internal service provider, our enabling services, I suppose, to help the department keep functioning at the level we want it to be functioning. But, frankly, to be in a coup role in a COVID environment is really, really interesting. It's, this is, again, the public service having to be dynamic and change and think about what people really need and how we can operate best while making sure we're first and foremost protecting our people and keeping everyone safe. So, yeah, it's been an interesting old journey.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like it. So one thing I'll just pick up on there, you said that you worked in a minister's office, in the Treasurer's office. Do you have any, and you also said that, you picked up how important relationships are to policy work and to government work. Do you have any, I guess, pearls of wisdom for how to manage that relationship between a minister's office and the public service? I guess particularly for APS level staff like me out there.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I think, working with ministers' offices, it's part of the bread and butter of being a public servant, but it is especially when you start doing it for the first time, it can be really challenging to know where the boundaries of the relationship sit and some of that sort of thing. Typically an engagement with an office would involve, quick phone calls or quick emails where something's needed urgently. So you've always got to be really mindful of the timeframes involved in requests and make sure you're clear about what you're delivering, because in the end there's nothing worse than working on something, getting it back to them and it not hitting the mark for what's needed. Time is critical on the Hill, and that's just the reality of the work environment up there. So really focusing on some of those key output pieces is really important. And remember that they're just people as well. If you level with people and have frank conversations with them about what they're really after, and if they're willing to share with you some of the, context they're working in for why there's a request coming, or, what they're ringing for, that always really helps as well. But that's all about fostering trusted, open relationships with people, and that's really critical.
Right. Great, well, thanks for that. Now, as you know, this edition of Connecting Us is all about policy under pressure, and by the sounds of it, you've had a lot of challenging roles. Can you tell us about a particularly challenging policy issue or project you've tackled, or maybe a set of tricky circumstances you've had to navigate in the policy world?
Yeah, sure. Tricky circumstances. There's lots of those, especially when you've worked on things like budgets and royal commissions. But maybe I'll talk a bit about, I led the incoming government briefing team in Prime Minister and Cabinet in 2016. That was a really amazing project to work on for many reasons, but at the time we were both trying to pull together the IGB itself with all the complex policy advice that needs to be corralled and brought together to create an IGB, but we were also doing an IT build at the same time to deliver an IGB on an app for the first time. And I think as a project together, that it was an amazing time and terrific experience. I had an amazing team that I worked with, and the whole department just came together really well around that project. But it was so complex. There were so many levels. It taught me a lot, I suppose, about extremely clear communication and really great planning, because you have a limited window for an election campaign where you're preparing an IGB. People are itching to know what the plan is, when particular policy positions and views are going to be landed amongst the senior executive. They just want a lot of certainty where quite often there's a lot of ambiguity.
So having moved between the APS and the Treasurer's office and now to the Treasury and some other things in between, do you have a favourite budget that you've been part of? Or are they all like your babies and you couldn't possibly choose?
That's funny. I'm known to be a bit of a budget junkie. It's quite sad. But
How many budgets now?
Well, I've worked very closely on 5, but I've many more than that, unfortunately, in different capacities. I love the budget process. That's a really sad thing to say, but it's true. It's just fascinating. It's one of those things where once you sort of understand the dynamics that come into a budget, you understand a lot more about how Canberra works, how a federal government works. It's just a really exciting process to be part of, but it's really eye-opening. And I couldn't
I'm glad you love it.
I couldn't possibly name my favourite, but we do like to keep budget papers from budgets you really loved working on. I'm one of those sad sort of people.
Is that like a photo album you have at home? You crack it out when the kids come around to visit? Or?
Well, people have been known to walk into my office and wonder why, in this day of digital budget papers being online, why I have so many hard copies, but I can't seem to part with some of them. It's a bit sad.
Do you read back through them?
No.
Just treasured mementos.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay, nice. So it sounds like your role must keep you pretty busy. I'm wondering if there's anything in particular in your life outside of work that really inspires you and drives you.
Yeah, for sure. So, look, I think becoming a mum's been the biggest game changer for me over the last few years. I've got a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, so I'm really in those heady days of very young children. That clearly has a huge impact on your life, the way you think about your job and your professional persona, I suppose, when your mind is often also thinking about how they're going at childcare or what's going on with them in their day and things like that. So, in terms of motivators for me, that's really shifted the dial a lot in terms of the way I think about, I guess my whole persona, not just my workplace persona.
Okay. So it's changed your relationship to work?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And look, I mean, I think that's in no way uncommon, but having kids, and certainly really young kids, it certainly means you've got to be much more disciplined about setting boundaries. That's an easy thing for people to say. I often listened and sympathised with people as they talked to me about that before I had kids, but living the process of setting boundaries is actually, I never realised that that's something you sort of have to learn. I've really found it interesting this second time coming back from maternity leave, particularly, that you've got to, it's a process of learning really to work out what boundaries work for you as an individual, how you can work with your organisation to make that fit work really well. And particularly for me, as a Band 2 who's trying to work 3 days a week, the organisational and role design piece that comes with that is really critical. And, to Treasury's credit, the senior exec here has been fantastic at being very open about that discussion, but it is a journey. You can't pretend these things start perfectly and, I turn up knowing exactly how I'm going to make it work, and the organisation automatically just knows how they're going to fit around everything.
So I imagine that it wouldn't have been too long ago that it would have been unthinkable for a Band 2 to be able to work part-time. Yeah,
well, I can't remember. Look, in all honesty, I can't remember too many in my APS career who have worked 3 days a week. But, as I said, I've had a lot of support here. It's not unprecedented in Treasury, but it is rare. And so, again, it's about being flexible and working out what arrangements work. Honestly, in some ways, the IT uplift that we've had by the COVID situation, which has forced departments and organisations all around the country to have to really work out different arrangements for people working flexibly, is going to be a real game changer, I think, for flexible work going forward.
And so I imagine that in your role as the COO, this lived experience will be something that you can feed right back into that policy creation within the department here.
Yeah, well, it's fantastic. I'm really thrilled to be able to give back to an organisation I've spent a lot of time in, now as the Chief Operating Officer. But I think having been on the policy side, I suppose, of Treasury, it's really terrific to come across with the experience I bring and work with the enabling services from everything from IT and security to people and organisational strategy and CFO and finance.
So that just makes me think, often when people talk about working in government and working on policy, they think about the external policy, the things that affect the broader Australian public, but the policy you're going to be working on now is, I guess, that more internal facing policy that affects the portion of the public who happens to work as a public servant. Do you think there are different ways of approaching those two different types of policy, or are they essentially the same but with different stakeholders?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think actually that's one of the things I'm finding the most interesting getting into this role, how much similarity there is in some areas and some respects that in the end, good planning, some of the basic skills and things you would expect, like good planning, good organisation, great communication, listening to your clients and your stakeholders, whoever they are. So in this case, ours are largely internal stakeholders, whereas most of the roles I've had before, they've been more external stakeholders. Some of these basic things about working in an organisation are sort of universal skills and traits, I suppose, that I'm trying to really draw into this role. But there's no doubt it's quite different not working on a big outward-facing policy issue.
Okay.
But there's lots of opportunities, I think, for people to get in and really use some intellectual capital in thinking about, how best can we design an organisation, or what can we be doing to improve our, IT services and data analytics and things like that. So there's some great opportunities.
So as we've spoken, you've actually naturally talked about 3 out of the 4 essential characteristics of great policy advice as defined by the Delivering Great Policy model. Read up on it in Connecting Us if you're interested. You've spoken about the importance of policy being clear on intent, being influential, being well informed. So just to close that loop a little bit, is there anything you can speak about how important it is for policy to be practical to implement?
Oh, sure. Gosh, that's so important at the moment. Practical to implement in the COVID environment has frankly been probably the most important of those 4, I think. Because of the timeframes involved, I can think of so many examples from JobKeeper right across the spectrum of things Treasury's been involved in, and more broadly, where pragmatism has been absolutely central to thinking about how what the right policy choices are in the COVID environment and how we implement them. So there's no question, I think both, that's so important as a mindset for public servants at the moment, that, first best policy, that well-worn debate about what the first best options might be, if they're not practical to implement particularly quickly at the moment. But if they're just not doable, that's not helpful in a COVID environment where we've had to respond so much more quickly than that. And I think to some extent the same goes even in my capacity as COO on the enabling services side too. We've got to be practical. We've got to be focused on what's doable quickly. When things go wrong, how do we fix them quickly? How do we support staff with practical solutions to just mean they can get on with things? There just hasn't been a choice. But frankly, this is where we've seen some of the best innovation and some of the best examples of the APS stepping up, with particularly the way we've supported people working flexibly, but not just limited to that, just the way I think people have the mobility within departments, the way there's been mobility across the public service to support really critical functions. This is the stuff I think that's really made people realise what the Australian Public Service is capable of, and that's been really fantastic to watch, I think.
And have you seen that there have been any, established policies or processes that have been really challenged through COVID, particularly around this practical aspect that we've just realised, actually, that's not practical anymore, we have to change it even though it's been in place for however long?
I think it's mostly the things I've seen have just been about the speed with which we can really do things. But certainly you probably wouldn't have thought there would have been so much flexibility to stand up and stand down teams, to provide data across jurisdictions from federal to state the way we've needed to really quickly to support decision making. There's been so many different ways that it's this is translated through. I think the collaboration across jurisdictions has also been fantastic, and Treasury plays a big role with that through our ComState division here, but a lot of agencies have been involved in those really critical discussions between jurisdictions.
Well, thanks so much for your time today, Liz. It's been really fascinating to hear your insights into delivering policy under pressure from so many different angles. And especially for me, the links that you've drawn between the external and internal policies that you've been working on, the similarities and differences there. I just think for me, it's a bit of a bugbear for some reason, hearing people thinking that internal policy isn't real policy. So the fact that you've worked on both of those is really fascinating. And also just to say how exciting it is to see a band too who's making part-time work happen. And I hope that we see more of it.
Thanks. Me too, for what it's worth. I think it's really important.
Yeah, great. Much more balanced people out there. And thanks everyone for listening. Don't forget to check out the latest edition of Connecting Us for more stories from your colleagues across the APS. The link will be in the show notes. Have a good one.
To Today's show was written and spoken by Mif Nazette with editorial input from Amelia Haddock. Matt Bully did the sound editing. Original music is by Ed Reading. Special thanks to Liz Williamson and the Treasury. Thanks for listening. We look forward to sharing more APS stories like this one with you through Connecting Us.